I shouldn't have gone into those woods. I knew better. Everyone in town did. But when my friend Brian called me on a Wednesday night and asked if I wanted to camp out for old time's sake, I caved. I didn't tell him I was having nightmares about the place, about the stories. They're just trees, I'd muttered to myself, tossing a flashlight and a knife into my bag. But they weren't. Not really. Brian picked me up around 5 p.m. in his rusted-out Jeep. His enthusiasm was infectious, and by the time we hit the gravel road leading to the woods, I'd almost forgotten the pit forming in my stomach. Almost. The deep woods stretched for miles, the trees so dense they swallowed daylight whole. By the time we parked, the sun was already setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. I stepped out and froze, feeling the oppressive silence. No wind, no birds, not even the distant hum of insects. Creepy as hell, right? Brian chuckled, slinging a pack over his shoulder. Let's go. We hiked a mile or so in, the trail narrowing as we ventured deeper. The deeper we went, the stranger I felt. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and pine. My flashlight flickered as we set up camp, but I didn't think much of it. That first night was uneventful, aside from the nagging feeling of being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia. Then came the second night. It started with the trees. I woke up to a sound like cracking bones. Outside the tent, the shadows of the trees looked wrong. They seemed closer, more gnarled. Their branches curled like hands reaching down. "Brian," I whispered. No answer. Unzipping my tent, I shone my flashlight into the darkness. It barely cut through the thick fog that had crept in overnight. "Brian," I called louder. I found his tent empty, the flap unzipped and fluttering faintly. His gear was still inside, untouched. The pit in my stomach returned tenfold. I circled our small campsite, calling his name, until something caught my eye. Footprints, deep, uneven, leading away from camp and into the woods. I followed the tracks. They led me through a labyrinth of trees, each step taking me further into the dark. The air felt colder here, and the silence was deafening. The footprints stopped abruptly at the base of a massive pine. Its bark was split open, revealing a hollow large enough to crawl through. Something glinted inside. "Brian." My voice cracked. No response. Against every instinct, I stepped forward, reaching into the hollow. My fingers brushed something cold and metallic. A compass. I pulled it out, recognizing it as Brian's. Then I heard it. A low growl like a deep guttural exhale. My flashlight flickered and died. I ran. I don't know how far or how long, but I didn't stop until I saw a faint glow in the distance. A campfire? Relief surged through me, but it was short-lived. The fire wasn't ours. The clearing was small, bordered by towering trees that seemed to lean inwards, their branches forming a canopy so thick not even starlight could penetrate. Around the fire were figures, 5 of them, sitting in utter stillness. "Brian," I whispered, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The figures didn't move. Their heads were tilted downward, faces obscured by the shadows. The fire flickered, casting strange shapes on the trees. Then, as if pulled by invisible strings, the figures turned their heads toward me in unison. Their eyes gleamed like wet stones, unblinking. Their mouths moved, but no sound came out. I stumbled back, tripping over a root. That's when I saw Brian. He was one of them. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes, those weren't his eyes. They were dark, empty voids. His head jerked unnaturally, the firelight reflecting off his skin like he was carved from something other than flesh. "Run," he mouthed, and I did. The forest seemed alive, the trees shifting to block my path. I swear I could hear them whispering, their branches creaking like ancient voices in a forgotten language. My legs burned, lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. I broke through the tree line just as dawn broke, collapsing onto the gravel road. The woods were behind me, silent and still, as if mocking me. Brian was never found, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of those trees, of the fire, of those eyes. And when I wake, I hear them, those whispers, coming from the edge of the forest. They're calling me back. The nightmares didn't stop after I got back. In fact, they got worse. It wasn't just Brian's face, pale, lifeless, and so utterly wrong, that haunted me. It was the sound, that low growl I'd heard in the woods, the one that had rattled my bones. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced it was right outside my window. I'd lie there, staring into the darkness, too afraid to move. Then, one night, it wasn't just in my head. Started around 2 a.m. I was sitting in my living room, the TV on low, trying to drown out the memories. My apartment was on the edge of town, not far from where the forest began. It wasn't a great place, but it was all I could afford after quitting my job. I couldn't focus on work anymore, couldn't focus on anything. The first sound was subtle, like twigs snapping underfoot. I muted the TV, my ears straining. Then came the scratching, soft, deliberate, like nails running down the side of the building. I told myself it was just a raccoon, maybe a stray cat, but deep down I knew better. The sound moved to the window. I froze, my eyes locked on the curtains. The scratching stopped, replaced by a low, raspy exhale. It fogged up the glass. Something was out there. I didn't want to look. I knew I shouldn't look, but I couldn't stop myself. The curtains shifted slightly as I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I pulled them back just enough to peek outside. Nothing, just the dark silhouette of the trees in the distance, swaying gently in the wind. I let out a shaky breath and stepped back. That's when I saw it. A handprint, smudged and greasy, pressed against the glass. Too big to be human. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My phone was on the couch. I grabbed it, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. But before I could hit call, the power went out. The TV blinked off, the lights died, and my phone went completely dark. I was plunged into silence. Then came the footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, circling the building. Whatever it was heavy. Each step sent a faint vibration through the floor. I clutched the knife I'd kept by my bed since coming back from the woods, my back pressed against the wall. The footsteps stopped at my door. For a moment, everything was still. Then the handle began to turn. It was locked, thank God, but the sound of metal rattling against metal made my skin crawl. My grip on the knife tightened as I moved toward the door. My heart was in my throat, pounding so loudly I was sure it would hear me. "Brian," a voice whispered. It wasn't Brian's voice. It was too deep, too distorted, like something imitating him. "Come outside," it said. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My entire body was shaking. The voice grew softer, almost pleading. "Please, it's so cold out here." The handle stopped turning. For a moment, I thought it was gone. Then the door began to buckle. The frame groaned as something slammed into it, over and over. Each hit sent splinters flying. Whatever was on the other side wasn't just strong, it was massive. I backed away, clutching the knife so tightly my knuckles turned white. The door wouldn't hold for much longer. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was worse than the noise. I stood there, every muscle in my body screaming, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The footsteps started again, moving away from the door. They circled the building once more before fading into the distance. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. The next morning I found claw marks on the door. For long, deep gouges that looked like they'd been carved by something with fingers the size of railroad spikes. The handprint on the window was gone. But when I stepped outside, I saw something else. Footprints. The same deep, uneven ones I'd seen in the woods. And they weren't leading away. They were leading back. For the next week, I tried to convince myself it was over. Whatever had followed me from the woods, if it had followed me at all, was gone. I stayed inside, kept the doors locked, the curtains drawn. I even taped the windows shut. But every night I heard it. The growl, the footsteps. Sometimes it was closer. Sometimes it sounded like it was right outside my window again. And then one night I made a mistake. I went back to the woods. The decision to return to the woods wasn't rational, it was desperation. Couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Whatever was happening, it wouldn't stop until I faced it. I armed myself as best I could. A flashlight, the knife, and a can of bear spray. I stuffed them into a backpack, along with a change of clothes and a bottle of water. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Who would believe me? By midnight, I was back at the edge of the deep woods. The trees loomed over me, their gnarled branches curling like claws against the starless sky. My gut screamed at me to turn back, but I pushed forward. The silence was suffocating. The deeper I went, the stranger everything became. The forest floor was littered with bones. Small ones, probably animals, though I couldn't be sure. The air smelled sour, like decay, and the ground was slick with a black, tar-like substance that clung to my boots. I'd been walking for what felt like hours when I heard it. That same low growl reverberating through the trees. My flashlight flickered, and the shadows around me seemed to shift. I spun around, heart racing, but there was nothing there. "Brian," I called, my voice trembling. The growl came again, louder this time, closer. My flashlight died completely, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled for the knife, gripping it tightly as I tried to control my breathing. Then I saw them. Eyes, dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dark. They were everywhere, peering from behind trees, low to the ground, high in the branches, unblinking, watching. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The eyes grew brighter, and the growl deepened, turning into something guttural, almost human. The air grew thick, pressing down on me like a weight. "Why did you come back?" a voice rasped. It was the same distorted voice that had spoken outside my apartment, but now it was coming from everywhere at once. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't obey. The air seemed to thicken with every step, slowing me down like I was wading through molasses. The eyes followed me, their glow growing brighter, more intense. Then I tripped. My hands hit the ground, sinking into the tar-like substance. It clung to my skin, cold and slimy, pulling me down. I struggled, but it was like quicksand. The more I fought, the deeper I sank. The growl was right behind me now. I looked up and saw it, a massive shape emerging from the shadows. It wasn't human, not anymore. Its body was twisted, elongated, with two long limbs that bent at impossible angles. Its skin was a patchwork of black and gray, glistening in the faint light. But it was its face that stopped my heart. It was Brian, or what was left of him. His eyes were gone, replaced by empty, glowing sockets. His mouth stretched too wide, filled with rows of jagged, uneven teeth. His head cocked unnaturally to one side as he stared down at me. "Why did you leave?" it rasped, the voice layered and broken, like multiple people speaking at once. I didn't mean to," I stammered, barely able to form words. "I didn't know." "Now you do," it said, and its mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile. The creature reached for me, its long fingers curling around my arm. Its touch burned, searing into my skin like fire. I screamed, thrashing against its grip, but it was too strong. "Join us," it whispered, its voice crawling into my ears, into my mind. "It's so quiet here, so peaceful. I don't know how I did it. Maybe it was adrenaline or pure, unfiltered terror, but I managed to grab the bear spray from my pack. I aimed blindly, spraying until the can was empty. The creature let out a deafening roar, its grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I scrambled to my feet, slipping on the tar, and ran. I didn't stop running until I was out of the woods, collapsing onto the gravel road. My lungs burned, my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't dare look back. When I finally reached my apartment, I locked every door, every window, and collapsed on the floor. My arm was throbbing where the creature had grabbed me, the skin red and blistered. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. It's been weeks since I went back to the deep woods. The burn on my arm never healed. It's black now, the skin cracking and flaking away, revealing something underneath, something that glows faintly in the dark. I don't leave my apartment anymore. I can't. I hear them every night, just outside the window. The growls, the whispers, and the eyes. They're waiting for me to come back, to join them, and I think I will. You might think that's where the story ends, me, trapped in my apartment, haunted by the memories of what I saw. But you'd be wrong, because the deep woods doesn't let you go. A week after I decided to barricade myself inside, I noticed something different. The whispers weren't just outside anymore. They were in the walls, in the air, in my head. Sometimes they'd mimic Brian's voice. Other times they'd sound like me, like some twisted, broken version of my own thoughts. Come back. You belong here. We're waiting. I stopped eating, sleeping, even checking my phone. Every shadow in my apartment felt alive. Every sound sent chills down my spine. But it wasn't until the lights started flickering that I realized they were coming for me. It began slowly. A bulb dimming here, a spark there. But then the lights started going out completely, one room at a time. The darkness crept closer, a living, breathing thing that pressed against the edges of my sanity. I tried every switch, every breaker, but nothing worked. The darkness had a will of its own. That's when I saw the first set of eyes. They appeared in the kitchen, glowing faintly in the corner. Then another pair in the bathroom mirror. Another on the ceiling. They weren't just watching me anymore. They were surrounding me. And then the growl. It was low, guttural, and everywhere at once. The walls shuddered as if something massive was pressing against them. The whispers turned into a deafening chorus, overlapping voices chanting the same word over and over. Come, come, come. I ran to the door, my heart pounding, but the lock wouldn't budge. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My chest heaved as I struggled to breathe. The whispers grew louder, the growl closer, and then silence. Complete, suffocating silence. And in that silence, a voice spoke. You can't run from the woods. It was Brian's voice, clear and cold, coming from right behind me. I turned slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me not to. He was there. Brian, or whatever he'd become, stood in the center of the room, his body twisted and wrong just like before. His glowing eyes locked onto mine, and he smiled. You left me, he said, his voice layered with something ancient and inhuman. But now you're coming back. Before I could react, the shadows around him moved. They stretched out like tendrils, wrapping around my wrists, my legs, my throat. They pulled me toward him, their touch ice cold and burning all at once. Stop! I screamed, thrashing against them. Let me go! Brian tilted his head, his smile widening. It's not up to you. The shadows dragged me to the floor, pinning me down as the room dissolved around me. The walls faded, replaced by trees, endless, towering trees. The air grew damp, heavy with the scent of pine and decay. I was back in the deep woods. The ground beneath me pulsed, as if the earth itself was alive. The shadows released me, slithering back into the trees, and I scrambled to my feet. The growling was louder now, reverberating through the forest like thunder. I turned, and there they were, the eyes, hundreds of them, glowing in the dark, attached to shapes that defied logic. Some were humanoid, others monstrous, their bodies blending into the trees like they were part of the forest itself. And at the center of it all stood Brian. He raised a hand and the growling ceased. The creatures stilled, their eyes fixed on me. You came back, he said, his voice echoing through the woods. Good. What do you want from me? I shouted, my voice cracking. Brian stepped closer, his movements jerky and unnatural. We want you to see, to understand. The woods aren't just a place. They're alive. And now, so are you. I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, I'm not like you. I'm not staying here. Brian smiled again, but there was no warmth in it. You don't have a choice. You were marked the moment you stepped inside. The woods claimed you. He gestured to my arm, where the blackened skin had spread. It was crawling up my shoulder now, glowing faintly like the creature's eyes. I could feel it moving under my skin, like worms burrowing deeper. I screamed, clawing at my arm, but it didn't stop. "You'll be one of us soon," Brian said, his voice almost gentle. "And when you are, you'll understand. The woods give, the woods take, and the woods never forget." The creatures began to move, closing in on me from all sides. Their shapes shifted, blending with the shadows, until I couldn't tell where they ended and the trees began. I turned and ran, the ground shifting beneath my feet, the growling rising behind me. The trees seemed to move, their branches reaching for me like claws. Every step was a battle, but I didn't stop. I could feel the blackness spreading, feel the woods pulling me back. But I didn't care. I wasn't going to let them take me. Not yet. I don't remember how I made it out. One moment, I was running through the trees, the growling at my heels. The next, I was collapsing onto the gravel road, the woods silent behind me. But I know they're still there, and I know they're waiting. You'd think escaping the woods would have been the end of it, that I could just pick up the pieces of my life and move on. But the deep woods doesn't work that way. It's been a month since I made it out, and I can feel it creeping closer. The mark on my arm hasn't healed. It's worse now, spreading across my chest, my neck, even my face. My skin feels cold, like it belongs to someone else, like it belongs to them. And at night, when I close my eyes, I see the woods. I hear the whispers. I see Brian. The first time I noticed the woods spreading was 2 weeks ago. I was sitting in my apartment, trying to distract myself with TV, when I smelled it. Damp earth and pine. The same smell that clung to the forest floor. I looked out the window, and my heart nearly stopped. The edge of the woods, which had been miles from my apartment, was closer. The trees were taller, their branches reaching for the sky like jagged spears. They were coming for me. I tried to ignore it, to convince myself it was my imagination. But every day, the forest crept closer. It wasn't just outside either. It was in the cracks of the walls, the shadows in the corners of my room. The floorboards groaned like they were alive, and the whispers grew louder. One night, I woke up to find dirt on my bed. It wasn't there when I fell asleep. The worst part? The footprints. They weren't mine. They were uneven, deep, like the ones I'd followed back in the woods. And they were leading to my bed. I tried everything, blessing the apartment, burning sage, even leaving town for a few days. But the forest followed me. It was always there, just out of sight, watching, waiting. One night, after weeks of sleepless nights, I gave in. I couldn't run anymore. I packed a bag and drove back to the woods. If they wanted me so badly, they could have me. But this time, I wasn't going to go quietly. I parked at the edge of the gravel road, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The forest was alive with noise, branches creaking, the wind howling like a living thing. My hands shook as I grabbed my gear. A crowbar, a flashlight, and the bear spray. "I'm here," I shouted into the trees. "What do you want from me?" The growl answered, deep and rumbling, vibrating through the air. The trees seemed to bend toward me, their branches clawing at the sky. I stepped forward, the flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. This time I wasn't afraid. I was furious. The deeper I went, the louder the growling became. The air grew thick, choking me with the scent of decay. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I thought I saw them, the eyes glowing faintly in the distance. "Show yourself," I yelled, and they did. The creatures emerged from the shadows, their bodies blending with the trees. There were more of them this time, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Brian was at the front, his face twisted into that awful, inhuman grin. "You came back," he said, his voice echoing through the woods. "Good." I raised the crowbar, my heart pounding. "I'm not afraid of you." Brian tilted his head, his smile widening. "You should be." The creatures lunged, their movements impossibly fast. I swung the crowbar, connecting with one of them. It shrieked, its body dissolving into black smoke, but the others didn't stop. They swarmed me, their claws tearing at my clothes, my skin. I fought like a madman, swinging the crowbar, spraying the bear spray, anything to keep them back. But it wasn't enough. They were too many, too strong. Brian stepped closer, watching with a strange, detached curiosity. "You can't fight the woods," he said. "You're already one of us." "No," I screamed, but I could feel it. The blackness spreading through me, the mark on my arm glowing brighter. Just as I was about to give in, I saw it. A light. It was faint, barely visible through the trees, but it was there. I stumbled toward it, the creatures clawing at my heels. The light grew brighter, stronger, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The creatures recoiled, their shrieks echoing through the forest. Brian stepped back, his smile faltering. "You can't leave," he growled. But I didn't stop. I don't know how I made it out. One moment, I was running toward the light. The next, I was standing on the gravel road, the forest silent behind me. The light was gone, but so were the creatures. For now, it's been 3 days since I escaped. The woods are still there, still creeping closer. The mark on my arm hasn't faded, and the whispers haven't stopped. But I've learned something. The woods might be alive. They might be unstoppable. But so am I. I don't know how much time I have left, but I'm not going down without a fight. The deep woods claimed Brian, but they won't claim me. Not yet. You'd think the fight was over, that the forest would give up after I escaped it twice. But the deep woods doesn't quit. It doesn't forgive, and it never forgets. I thought I was safe, but the woods had other plans. It started the night after I wrote down everything that happened, trying to make sense of it all. Maybe it was a form of therapy, or maybe I just needed to see the words on the page to convince myself it was real. But the moment I hit save, the power went out. The room plunged into darkness, and the now familiar growl echoed from somewhere outside. It was faint, distant, but it was there. I grabbed my flashlight and my crowbar, my constant companion since my last escape, and edged toward the window. The trees were closer. What had been a faint outline at the edge of town was now unmistakable. The deep woods had pushed forward overnight, swallowing entire blocks of houses. I could see them now, looming like sentinels, their gnarled branches casting twisted shadows under the moonlight. And then the eyes. They were back. This time, the creatures didn't wait for me to come to them. They came to me. The first sign was the scratching at the door. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragging across the wood. I held my breath, gripping the crowbar tightly. The sound grew louder, more frantic, until it stopped altogether. Silence. I inched closer, heart pounding, and then boom. Something slammed into the door, hard enough to rattle the hinges. The growl returned, low and guttural, followed by a voice that chilled me to my core. "Let us in." It wasn't just Brian's voice this time. It was everyone's. A cacophony of voices, overlapping, distorted, pleading and commanding all at once. "Let us in." I backed away, my hands trembling. The door began to splinter under the weight of their assault. I knew it wouldn't hold for long. My mind raced, searching for a way out. That's when I remembered the light, the one that had saved me in the woods. I didn't know what it was or where it came from, but it was my only hope. I grabbed my flashlight and bolted for the back door, bursting into the cold night air. The forest was closer than ever, the trees practically leaning over the house. The growling followed me, growing louder with every step. I didn't look back. I ran blindly, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The streets were empty, eerily silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Every shadow felt alive, every corner a potential trap. The town was unrecognizable, overgrown with vines, the buildings crumbling as if the forest was consuming them. The whispers returned, wrapping around me like a cold wind. "Come back. You can't escape. You belong to us." But I didn't stop. I kept running, the light from my flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. And then I saw it, the glow. It was faint, barely visible through the thick fog that clung to the ground. But it was enough. I sprinted toward it, the growling and whispers closing in around me. The light grew stronger, brighter, until it enveloped me completely. The creatures stopped. Their growls turned to shrieks, and the whispers became deafening. The air felt electric, charged with a force I couldn't understand. The light burned through the darkness, pushing the forest back. And then I saw her. She stood at the center of the light, her figure almost too bright to look at. She wasn't human, not entirely. Her body shimmered, translucent, her face obscured by the glow. But her presence was undeniable. She radiated power, like she belonged here, like she was part of the woods and yet separate from them. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't have a choice," I managed, my voice shaking. "They won't leave me alone." She tilted her head, studying me. "Because you carry their mark. You've seen them. You've survived them. That makes you dangerous." I didn't understand. "What do you mean?" "The deep woods doesn't just claim people, changes them. And you?" Her gaze flicked to the mark on my arm. "You're not fully theirs. Not yet. That terrifies them." I looked down at the mark, the blackened veins spreading across my skin, pulsed faintly, in time with the whispers. "Can you stop it?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "Can you get rid of it?" She hesitated, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression that looked like sorrow. "The mark is part of you now. I can't take it away, but I can help you control it." "How?" "You have to face them. Not run. Not fight. Face them. Only then will you understand what you've become." Before I could respond, the light began to fade. The creatures were regrouping, their glowing eyes appearing in the darkness once more. The woman stepped back, her form dissolving into the glow. "Remember," she said, "the woods are alive, and so are you." Then she was gone. The light disappeared, leaving me alone in the dark. The creatures were closing in, their whispers growing louder, their eyes locking onto me. But this time I didn't run. I turned to face them, gripping the crowbar in one hand, the flashlight in the other. The mark on my arm burned, brighter than ever, and the whispers shifted, less threatening, more curious. And then I spoke. "I'm not afraid of you." The growling stopped. The creatures hesitated, their forms flickering like shadows. The forest seemed to hold its breath. And for the first time, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Control. The moment I stood my ground, the forest seemed to pause. The growling softened, the glowing eyes dimmed, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted just slightly. It was as though the deep woods was waiting, watching, testing me. The mark on my arm burned hotter, spreading further across my chest and neck, but I didn't falter. Couldn't. Something deep inside me, the part that had survived this nightmare twice, refused to back down. "I'm not afraid of you," I said again, louder this time. And then the forest answered. The creatures began to shift, their shapes twisting and reforming like smoke caught in a windstorm. The glowing eyes disappeared, replaced by faces, human faces, familiar faces. Brian was at the front, his expression no longer twisted into that inhuman grin. He looked like he had before all this, but his eyes were filled with sorrow. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice trembling. "You promised we'd stick together." The others stepped forward. Neighbors, strangers, even people I didn't recognize but somehow knew. They all looked at me, their faces a mix of anger and grief. "You left us. You abandoned us. You're one of us now." The whispers were deafening, overlapping until I couldn't tell one voice from the next. My head throbbed, my vision blurred, and for a moment, I felt myself slipping, losing control. But then I remembered what the woman in the light had said. "Face them." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "I didn't abandon you," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know how to help." Brian stepped closer, his form flickering like a dying flame. "You could have stayed," he said. "You could have saved us." "No," I said, meeting his gaze. "I couldn't. The woods took you. It wasn't my fault." The mark on my arm flared, a searing pain that made me stumble. But I didn't stop. "I'm still here," I said. "I'm still fighting. But I'm not going to let you take me too." The creatures froze, their forms rippling like water. The forest groaned, the trees bending and twisting, their branches reaching toward me. The mark burned brighter, spreading up my face, but instead of fear, I felt something else. Power. The whispers changed, turning into a low hum that vibrated through the air. The creatures began to retreat, their glowing eyes flickering out one by one. Even Brian's form started to fade, his expression softening. "You don't belong to us anymore," he said, his voice barely audible. The forest began to dissolve, the shadows pulling back, the air growing lighter. The mark on my arm cooled, its glow fading into a dull pulse. The deep woods was letting me go. I don't know how long I stood there, watching as the trees receded into the distance, their oppressive presence lifting for the first time in weeks. When I finally turned to leave, I realized I was standing at the edge of the gravel road. The woods were behind me, silent, still, for now. It's been a week since that night, and I've started to piece my life back together. The mark on my arm is still there, faint but permanent, a reminder of what I survived. The nightmares have stopped, and the whispers are gone. But I know the deep woods is still out there, waiting, watching. And I know one day it might call me back. But this time I'll be ready. You'd think the story was over, that I'd finally escaped the deep woods and could start living my life again. But the thing about the woods is this: once it touches you, it never truly lets go. And neither does the mark. A few days after I thought I was free, I started noticing changes. It was subtle at first. My hearing sharpened. I could hear conversations from across the street, the faint rustle of leaves, even the buzzing of a fly trapped in the next room. My vision followed. I could see in the dark as if it were daylight, every detail sharp and vivid. First, I thought it was a gift, a lingering side effect of the woods trying and failing to claim me. But then came the hunger. It started with food. No matter how much I ate, I never felt full. Burgers, pasta, sandwiches, none of it satisfied me. Then the cravings began. Raw meat, the metallic tang of blood. The sound of a rabbit scurrying in the bushes made my mouth water. I tried to ignore it, but the hunger only grew stronger, clawing at my insides like a living thing. The mark on my arm burned every time it came, a painful reminder of what I'd brought back with me. And then one night I lost control. It was late. The moon was full, its light spilling through my apartment window. I hadn't eaten all day, too afraid of what I might crave next. My hands trembled as I paced the room, my mind racing. That's when I heard it, the faint scuffle of paws on the pavement outside. I looked out the window and saw a stray dog sniffing around a garbage can. My stomach twisted, my mouth watering. I didn't remember opening the door. I didn't remember stepping outside. But suddenly, I was in the alley, the dog frozen in my flashlight beam. It whimpered, backing away, but I was faster. I woke up hours later, my hands and face covered in blood. The realization hit me like a freight train. The woods hadn't just marked me, they changed me. I wasn't just connected to them, I was becoming them. I spent the next few days in a haze, too scared to leave my apartment, too scared to trust myself. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw it. The faint glow in my eyes, the way my teeth seemed sharper, my skin paler. The hunger was always there, a constant, gnawing presence. And then the forest came back. It started with the dreams. I was running through the woods, my body moving on instinct. The trees whispered my name, their branches parting to let me pass. The ground beneath my feet pulsed like a heartbeat, guiding me deeper and deeper into the dark. Every time I woke, the mark on my arm was brighter, spreading further across my body. And every time I felt less human. I tried to fight it, to push it down, but the pull of the woods was stronger than ever. One night, I woke up standing in the middle of my living room, my bare feet covered in dirt. The window was open, the cool night air carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I knew then that I couldn't run anymore. The deep woods wasn't coming for me. I was going back to it. I packed what little I thought I'd need. A flashlight, my crowbar, and the knife I'd carried before. This time, though, I didn't bother with food or water. I knew it wouldn't matter. The forest was waiting. When I reached the edge of the woods, it felt like coming home. The trees seemed taller, darker, their branches curling like welcoming arms. The whispers returned, not threatening this time, but coaxing, beckoning. The mark on my arm flared, the pain almost unbearable. I stepped forward, and the woods swallowed me whole. I don't remember how long I wandered. Hours, days, it didn't matter. The forest felt alive around me, shifting and pulsing with every step I took. The hunger grew stronger, and I didn't fight it anymore. I let it guide me. That's when I found them. The creatures were waiting in a clearing, their glowing eyes fixed on me. Brian stood at the center, his face calm, almost serene. "You came back," he said, his voice no longer distorted. "I didn't have a choice," I replied, my voice steady. "You know that." Brian nodded, stepping closer. "The woods don't just take, they transform. And you've always belonged here." I felt it then, the truth in his words. The mark wasn't a curse. It was a bond, a connection to something ancient and powerful. The woods weren't my enemy. They were a part of me, and I was a part of them. The creatures surrounded me, their forms shifting, merging with the shadows. The hunger faded, replaced by a strange sense of peace. The whispers grew louder, but this time, they weren't calling me back. They were welcoming me home. I don't know who I am anymore. Maybe I'm still me. Maybe I'm something else entirely. But one thing is certain. I'm not leaving the woods again, because now the deep woods isn't just a place. It's me. If you thought that was the end, you'd be mistaken. I wish it were. I wish I could tell you the deep woods had taken me completely, that I'd disappeared into its embrace like so many others before me. But the woods had one more twist, one more cruel game to play. And this time, it wasn't just about me. Days, weeks, maybe even months passed. Time didn't mean much in the woods. I was part of it now, hunting, moving, existing as something neither fully human nor fully creature. The hunger was gone, replaced by a strange, steady rhythm that pulsed through the earth and into my bones. The woods whispered constantly, telling me things I shouldn't know, things about the people who lived on the edges of its shadow, people who didn't respect it, people it wanted to claim. And then one day, the woods gave me a name. Emily. I didn't recognize it at first. Emily was just a stranger, a hiker who'd wandered too close to the deep woods. But the moment I heard her name, something stirred inside me. Memories, faces, my old life clawing its way back to the surface. Emily was my sister. I'd spent so long forgetting who I was, letting the forest reshape me, that I almost didn't believe it. But the more the woods whispered her name, the clearer the memories became. Emily and I as kids, playing in the backyard. Emily crying at my bedside after I escaped the woods the first time. Emily begging me to let her help. And now she was coming for me. I found her near the edge of the forest, her backpack heavy with supplies, a flashlight clutched in one hand. She was calling my name, her voice breaking with every step deeper into the trees. "Jake!" she cried. "I know you're out here. Please, just come back." For a moment, I hesitated. The part of me that was still human wanted to run to her, to tell her to leave before it was too late. But the woods had other plans. Her name wasn't just a warning. It was a command. The forest began to shift, the trees groaning as their branches reached for her. The air thickened, the whispers growing louder, wrapping around her like a noose. Emily froze, her flashlight flickering as she spun in circles, trying to find the source of the sound. "Jake!" she called again, her voice trembling. "Is that you?" I stepped into the clearing, my body half hidden in the shadows. Her eyes widened as she saw me, relief washing over her face. "Jake! Oh my God! You're alive!" I wanted to speak, to tell her to run, but the words wouldn't come. The forest wouldn't let me. "Come with me," she said, taking a step toward me. "We'll figure this out. We'll fix it." The woods growled in warning, and I felt it, the pull, the hunger returning. It wasn't mine. It was the forest's. It wanted her. Emily must have seen the change in me, the way my body tensed, the way my eyes glowed faintly in the dark. She stopped, her face pale. Jake, what's happening to you? I took a step back,